Hi, everybody.
It's quite a group formulating already. Wow.
Yeah.
So we'll give it one more minute, and then I'm going to call us to order.
That's great.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us this evening on this beautiful fall night in New York City. I am coming to you from the New School for Social Research. Actually, was able to get into my office for this. Unfortunately, I'm on my own, so I apologize for that in advance. I'm very happy to welcome you all today to celebrate and learn more about this marvelous, marvelous book by our colleague, Aaron Jakes. I'm going to show it to you here, but it's of course going to be backwards. Egypt's Occupation, Colonial Economism, and the Crises of Capitalism. I'll just say at the outset that Aaron is going to very kindly put a coupon in the chat feature of our Zoom, which will take you to the press where you can obtain the book yourself if you don't have a copy already. And we will begin. So again, welcome. Thank you for coming. Our evening is sponsored tonight by the New School for Social Research, the Heilbronner Center for Capitalism Studies, and the History Department at the New School. We have a magnificent lineup that I'm going to announce for you tonight in discussion and a panel discussion about the book that I will moderate, and then we'll have some questions and answers with our Zoom audience. I may need to turn off my camera as I do that on my phone, just to keep things from being too distracting. So just I'll warn everybody ahead of time of that. Before I introduce our panelists and walk through the lineup for the evening, I'd like to thank, on behalf of Aaron, the entire panel, the Heilbronner Center, the History Department, the New School for Social Research, a number of really important people. Number one, Annie Huraka, Kielev I'm so sorry, Galev, and Joseph Carney for all of their support with the logistics of planning this webinar, which of course creates its own headaches and hassles that they've artfully managed so well. They'll be recording the event for tonight, so that's great. We'll be able to redistribute it. Tonight's event, as I said, is co-sponsored by the Department of Historical Studies, the Center for Capitalism Studies, and the new Critical Perspectives on Democratic Anti-Colonialism project. Aaron would also like to thank Sherry Cohen at the New School for Social Research, Adela Lucas at Lang, Layla Lynn at the Heilbronner Center, Stephanie Adams and Bridget Kinsella at Stanford University Press for all of their assistance in promoting this event. So for everyone who doesn't have copies of the book, please, Aaron's making me say this. He's telling me to advise you that it will make an excellent holiday gift for anyone and everyone. And I do agree with him. And he has shared, again, the flyer in the flyer/coupon in the chat function. All right, so with all of that being said, let me introduce our lineup for the evening. First, we'll hear from our colleague in the History Department, Emma Park. Next, we'll hear from Benoit Challand in the Sociology Department. We will have the third comment from Anne Stoller, our colleague in anthropology. Then we'll have a final comment from Nancy Fraser, our colleague in politics and philosophy. Nancy's going to be joining us a little bit late, so you'll see her pop into the panel. Don't be surprised. Aaron will follow those panel comments with a response, and then we'll have a bit of a discussion amongst the panelists, moderated by myself, before we turn it over for questions and answers with the audience. Audience members, please feel free to use the question and answer function in Zoom to pose your question as the evening unfolds. We've got a very big turnout tonight, so I know that we won't be able to get to everybody. But what I'll try to do is monitor the Q&A such that we hit, some of the big concerns, the big high points, and areas of engagement. So with all that being said, I'm going to turn off my microphone and welcome again our colleague Emma Park from the History Department to start us off with her comment.
Sorry, slight mix-up. I'm starting us off.
Oh, you are? Okay.
Yeah, it's okay.
We say to you on behalf of all of your colleagues at the New School, congratulations on your magnificent book, and please introduce this new addition to our intellectual family to your many assembled fans and friends.
All right, thanks, Julia. So let me just get set up here. I'm going to share my screen. And, oops. Okay, all right. So thanks again, Julia, and thanks to everybody for coming. I just want to make sure, fellow panelists, can you hear me okay? Okay, great. Okay, I'm just really excited and grateful to be speaking tonight with all of you and with this amazing panel of my esteemed colleagues and friends. Pretty much anyone who has taken a class with me in recent years has experienced what I often refer to as the imagined reader conversation. Early in most of my seminars, we talk about how one set of questions a good historian ought to ask in picking up any text concerns its intended audience and the working assumptions that the author has made about that readership. From there, I'll usually turn to the challenges of identifying our own imagined readers when we sit down to do our own writing. I'll point out that the actual reader of the essays that my students produce, i.e. me, is different than the imagined reader for whom they'll need to craft the exposition of their arguments and the presentation of their historical evidence. And at some point along the way, at least in recent years, I've usually admitted that this is a problem that has occupied quite a bit of my own time, usually in the wee hours of the morning, in the course of writing my first book. Well, when I sent off the final proofs of the book this summer and started thinking about this event, I realized that my own imagined reader was in many ways a composite of my amazing colleagues here at the New School. From everything I've learned from their work over the years, to their meticulous comments on multiple drafts of the manuscript, to insights that so often emerge from casual conversations in the hallways and before faculty meetings, the normally solitary process of writing a book rarely felt to me like a lonely enterprise, because this rambunctious, opinionated, interdisciplinary community of scholars has provided so much help and support along the way. So it seemed only fitting to me to find out what happened when at least some of those imagined readers who have been inspiring me and living inside my head for such a long time became actual readers of the book. Now, I'm selfishly much more interested to know what all of them have to say than what I do. But since the goal here is to have a conversation that includes this great audience from all over the world, and because I'm hoping that this event will cause at least some people who haven't yet read the book to decide to do so, I'm going to start us off with a very brief sketch of the story that the book tells and some of its major arguments. Okay, first, some background. In the simplest sense, the book is about the 4 decades of British rule in Egypt that followed the military invasion of 1882. In the prior decades of the 19th century, the Ottoman military officer Mehmed Ali Pasha and his successors had pursued an ambitious project of state building to secure an autonomous dynasty for themselves in what had long been one of the most valuable provinces of the Ottoman Empire. While they succeeded in that objective, securing for their family a lineage that would rule Egypt until 1953, it came at an enormous cost. From the 1820s onwards, this new regime forced Egyptian peasants to convert more and more of the country's precious farmland to cotton cultivation for export to the textile mills of northern England. And beginning in the 1850s, to capitalize a series of increasingly grandiose infrastructural projects, they began to contract loans with the major financial houses of Europe. After a spate of excess borrowing in the boom years of the American Civil War, the Egyptian government faced a serious budgetary shortfall when the war ended and cotton prices fell. By 1876, they had defaulted on their loan payments. Representatives of the foreign bondholders at that point seized control of the state's finances and imposed harsh austerity measures. By the early 1880s, public outrage at these arrangements had coalesced into a growing movement for fiscal autonomy and constitutional rule. Fearing that if the movement succeeded, Egypt would halt payment on its debts, Britain found pretext in the summer of 1882 to invade the country and quash the uprising. Though Egypt officially remained a province of the Ottoman Empire, ruled by the Khedive or Ottoman vice-regent and his ministers, British officials thereafter exercised increasing control over the institutions of the state by attaching advisors and inspectors to the various ministries. Egypt's occupation offers an account of this peculiar form of British rule that emerged after 1882 and of the diverse political struggles that it engendered. Though it certainly contains many others, the book makes three broad arguments that run through the narrative of the 8 chapters. First and most significant among them is that the British occupation of Egypt was informed by and organized around the discourse that I refer to as colonial economism. At its core, colonial economism entailed a set of manifestly experimental propositions about the character of so-called Oriental subjects. Now, I suspect that we're going to spend a fair amount of time tonight talking about histories and theories of economism. For now, I'll offer just 2 opening comments about the choice of terminology. First, as the word is employed today, economism usually refers to a methodological problem, a decision to focus on economic forces rather than other possible factors in the analysis and explanation of this or that social phenomenon. I'm suggesting instead that we can and should treat economism as a way of apprehending the world particular to the history of capitalism itself. In other words, as a problem that already exists within various social formations, rather than only in the minds of scholars making claims about them. Second, to the extent that historians and social theorists have tried to explain rather than simply correct or denounce economism, they've usually done so by way of ideological or political affiliation. In plainer terms, economism is often invoked as one of the unique crimes of Marxist thought. The point here, at least for now, is that this remarkably durable association has made it all too easy to ignore or dismiss forms of economism that circulate well beyond the confines of the political left. The colonial officials I study were not reading Marx, and they would have hated what he had to say if they had been. They nevertheless made claims about the power of economic determination that might have put the most dogmatic of Stalinists to shame. And ironically enough, they sometimes used base superstructure metaphors to explain their ideas. But crucially, when they did so, they also insisted that some populations of people were more susceptible to the play of economic forces than others. In other words, their way of talking about economic determination was a way of making claims about racial difference. With remarkable consistency, British officials proposed that most Egyptians were capable of no more and no less than a bare recognition of their own basic material interests. On the one hand, their responsiveness to economic gain and loss meant that they could and should be more actively integrated into the transactions of modern commercial society, and that they would judge British rule by the economic gain it could deliver. On the other, what Egyptians purportedly lacked was the wherewithal to reason beyond the calculus of individual profit and loss. And it was only that comprehension of a wider public good that qualified some communities of people to govern themselves. Put differently, in a country like Egypt, the core principles of liberal political economy could, under the right sort of government, hold true. Liberal political theory could not. Though ideas of this sort saturate the public reports with which Lord Cromer, the British official at the helm of the occupation, and his staff sought to justify their role to publics in both Egypt and abroad, they did not represent a mere public gloss on some other hidden imperial logics. Rather, I argue the discourse of colonial economism actively informed and shaped the sorts of policies the occupation pursued. Notions about the innate potential of Egypt's smallholding peasants as productive economic subjects figured centrally in British plans for the country's economic recovery. The occupation's early efforts to augment and regulate supplies of irrigation water, to build new dams, roads, and railways, to diminish the government's reliance on conscript labor, and to standardize rights to landed property were all premised on the notion that peasants would recognize and seize upon their own interests, most of all by growing more cotton. But that same claim about a narrow responsiveness to material interests also stamped the other side of the coin, so to speak. Beginning in the 1890s, as their position in the country grew more secure, the British moved to actively shut down existing avenues of political participation for which they deemed Egypt's peasantry utterly unqualified. Following the appointment of a new British advisor to the Ministry of Interior, one of his first acts in control of the provincial administration was to abolish the system of village elections through which the rural populace had once exercised at least a nominal say over the appointment of local officials. Significant as these changes were to the organization of the Egyptian state, the most dramatic and distinctive implications of colonial economism took the form of a series of experiments with agricultural credit that also began in the 1890s. For decades now, Egypt has figured as an exemplary case of peripheralization within the geographies of global capital. On this understanding, British rule simply served to affirm and consolidate the country's existing role as a vast cotton plantation supplying cheap raw materials for European industry. All but obscured in such accounts is Egypt's emergence as a key target and laboratory for investment and experimentation in the worldwide expansion of metropolitan financial networks around the turn of the last century. This is the book's second major argument. That a de facto colonial territory like Egypt became a major site for European investment in the late 19th century is not at all surprising. That such investment assumed the form of banks making loans of various kinds directly to colonial subjects themselves was. One of the occupation's most contentious propositions was the notion that even humble Egyptian smallholders could, under the right circumstances, employ mortgage credit responsibly as farm capital. At a moment when a rising cohort of conservative administrators was elsewhere arguing that colonial populations should be insulated from the vagaries of the world market, Lord Cromer's regime in Egypt advanced a series of policies aimed at extending the reach of European financial networks into the countryside. Though they claimed that the ensuing wave of mortgage finance would redound to the benefit of Egypt's small, hardworking peasants, the lending practices of these new financial institutions in fact served to amplify existing patterns of social and geographic inequality. But at the same time, the massive influx of foreign capital in the decade between 1897 and 1907 did contribute to a rapid and dramatic surge in land prices and asset values. As boosters and promoters of the occupation marveled at the country's newfound wealth, the occupation could and did claim that its experimental program of economic development was succeeding. Oops. Sorry. This was the conundrum that a young Egyptian journalist named Ahmed Helmi described when he suggested that the British spoke as if money were coming out of their mouths. In its heyday, what Helmi called gilded speech placed the diverse critics of British rule in a double bind. It forced them to engage with the occupation on its own terms, even as they argued that these were the wrong terms upon which to establish a political order. From the moment an organized opposition emerged in the 1890s, its members recognized and bemoaned the distinctiveness of a regime that reduced the role of government to economic development and alleged that Egyptians cared about little else. In response, they sought both to defend a range of alternative criteria for political legitimacy and to document evidence that the occupation's chosen indicators of material prosperity were a deceptive stand-in for the lived experiences of Egyptians under British rule. On the other hand, they also recognized the hazards of accepting the official measures of prosperity at face value. And from the late 19th century onwards, they analyzed the political economic transformations that British rule had introduced with an eye towards substituting more critical assessments of the occupation's vaunted achievements. This is the book's third major argument, namely that the nationalist movement of the 1900s emerged in and through a series of efforts to redefine the relationship between the economic and the political in both thought and practice. The most perspicacious of the occupation's Egyptian critics observed at the height of the boom in the early 1900s that the country's new financial wealth was increasingly uneven, abstract, and ephemeral in nature. The advent in 1907 of what contemporary reporting in both Arabic and European papers dubbed the financial crisis rearranged the terms of the mounting struggle over British rule in several ways at once. Because the crises of 1907 were a worldwide phenomenon, their occurrence furnished a range of opportunities to compare Egypt's experience under occupation with other parts of the globe. Rather than the insular domains that official discourse had often held them to be, the occupation's critics now argued that the crisis revealed all the more clearly that the economic and the political were necessarily connected. This nationalist critique of economism as such resonated powerfully with a core premise of the labor militancy that began to occur with increased frequency in these years. In the long aftermath of 1907, Egyptian workers and students who organized themselves into unions and went on strike linked their grievances directly to the political exclusions of imperial rule. They protested not simply for improved wages, but for a collective role in determining their own conditions of life. For the occupation, too, the crisis precipitated a stark reassessment of earlier positions. Confronted with both the manifest collapse of their developmentalist schemes and an increasingly robust opposition capable of mobilizing a growing array of popular forces, the British interpreted these events not as evidence of their own maladministration, but as an indication that their own optimistic hypotheses about Egyptians as racialized subjects had been misplaced. It was at this point that officials in Cairo began to draw more directly on the mode of ethnographic conservatism that had been gaining ground in British India for several decades. By 1910, this concerted shift had led to both a ruthless crackdown on political opposition in the cities and an increasingly heavy-handed regime of agricultural regulation in the countryside. The diverse manifestations of crisis in the early 1900s added force to arguments that only a government controlled by Egyptians themselves would respond to their needs and desires. But those same phenomena raised questions about the preconditions of independence itself. Nationalist critics might now attribute the tangling of credit relations, the acceleration of land transactions, or the spread of financial speculation to specific policies that the British had imposed. But those policies drew Egypt into a set of dependencies that had long since exceeded the particular institutions, colonial or otherwise, that first set them in motion. So long as large segments of the Egyptian public depended on regular flows of foreign capital to sustain their everyday lives, the independence they demanded could no longer be construed in narrowly political terms. Understood in this way, the central concern in these years of what is often labeled economic nationalism was not with industrialization or a lack thereof, but with human freedom. Where generations of scholarship on nationalism since Benedict Anderson have insisted on its political and intellectual emptiness or vacuousness, the final chapter of the book explores the efforts of several influential figures to position their conception of Egyptian nationalism as a viable alternative to the major ideological currents of their times. In so doing, they arrived at a rigorous critique of economism, albeit by other names, as a historical problem conditioned by discrete forms of social practice. In other words, if Egyptians seemed to behave more and more like the grasping, self-interested individuals that the British had long alleged them to be, these figures argued, it was not by virtue of racial defect or civilizational backwardness, but because they inhabited a society that made it increasingly difficult and perilous to do otherwise. But in identifying the origins and perpetuation of such conditions with the malign effects of colonial rule, they most often pursued their own insights toward an indictment not of capital in general, but of foreign capital. The upshot, I'll conclude, was a persistent, almost willful confidence in the power of national capital and national institutions to resolve the devastating contradictions they themselves so forcefully denounced in their own situation. I'd like to stop now and leave ample time for comments from the others, but what I'm trying to get at here is that the approach to the history of nationalism that I'm trying to advance in the book is one that suggests our critiques of nationalism need to take more adequate account of exactly why this set of ideas became so compelling to such a broad swath of Egyptian society and other societies all around the world in the particular moment that it did. So I will end there and pass things off to Emma.
Hello, everyone. Okay, so I don't want to take too long here today because I think that Aaron's goal in organizing this event the way that he has is really with the hopes of opening up conversation. So in that spirit, I'm going to try and be quite brief in my remarks. I've now had the pleasure of reading this book in at least 2 iterations, and I'm so excited to see it between 2 covers and thrilled to be part of this conversation with you all today. I'm going to begin by outlining what I view, and apologies, some of this will be a repetition, what I view as being the core claims of the book. Then I'm going to reflect on the colonial state and its quote unquote amphibious relations with foreign capital, that is the complex relations between state and capital in the context of the British occupation. Third, I'm going to try and think about some of the processes that Aaron lays out in contrast to the place that I'm more familiar with, which is Kenya and East Africa more broadly. I have some questions here about the construction of Egyptian peasants as investable subjects. And here I also want to think about the lumpiness of imperial space, particularly by thinking through the relationship between empire, capital, and the production of categories of racial difference, especially right in the case of that Aaron lays out, specifically in relation to the claim regarding the ways that racial types were premised on assumptions surrounding what kinds of economic subjects Egyptian peasants were. Finally, I have a question about source space and methodology. And I want to ask Aaron about the bigger implications regarding his arguments surrounding economism and the persistent and durable labors to reject the narrowness of that framing. So those of you who have read the work know that some of what Aaron is interested in doing is demonstrating the ways in which an economistic view of Egyptians, peasants in particular, was brought to bear in shaping colonial policies in the context of a rather unsteady colonial occupation. I think that really crucial here is the fact that the British came in to protect the interests of foreign capital in the context of what they argued was a faltering regime, unable to pay back debts to foreign creditors. In pursuit of making this claim, and I think again here the specifics really matter, Aaron articulates a colonial vision that presupposed the limited intellectual purview or capacity of Egyptian subjects on the basis of an argument that insofar as their immediate wants and interests were served, not only would they support the occupation, but that they would not engage in political agitation. And here I think there is a really interesting conversation to be had about what constitutes the parameters of the political, both as a kind of edict category. Sorry, life continues happening outside. So here I think there is a really interesting conversation to be had about what constitutes the parameters of the political as edict versus emic categories, that is analytic categories versus the ways our historical subjects are thinking about them, in relation to the broader claim regarding the bifurcation of the world into the political on the one hand and the economic on the other. And so I do now want to transition to talk briefly about this supposed bifurcation, because one of the striking things about this book is that of course it doesn't work, right? This division of the world into the economic on the one hand and the political on the other. Neither for the British colonial state, the state in occupation, nor for the subjects of British rule is this bifurcation actually accepted. So even though Cromer is making an economistic argument about the narrow self-interest of Egyptians, it's always clear to him that this is a project designed to secure a set of political aspirations, right? Even if these aspirations are decidedly anti-political in character. In other words, his anti-political goals tacitly belie the supposed bifurcation of the world, I think. Or maybe that's a question, right? Much less does this division of the world hold for the people over whom the British are ruling. Perennially and consistently over the course of the narrative, it's very clear that there's a robust rejection of this narrowly economistic vision, whereby material gain can function as a kind of anti-politics machine, here to use the language of James Ferguson. Instead, people are persistently reweaving together these domains that theoretically, ideologically, and in practice, the British are trying to hold apart. But given the actual synergy between the concurrent coupling and decoupling on the side of the colonial state of the economic and the political on the one hand, and the persistent insistence on their necessary interconnection on the part of Egyptians on the other, it really did get me thinking about this supposed bifurcation in the first place. Right, we now have a robust literature on this. Nancy Fraser, of course, has written about this, as has Ellen Wood and Wendy Brown, but it did leave me wondering when and where does this actual bifurcation actually materialize outside of the ideological claim of the separation? In other words, is this separation ever actually borne out in practice? Right, and I think this is one of the things that Nancy's work is so good at highlighting, right? The political as a necessary background condition. But I guess I wanted to ask this of you, Erin, ask about this tension, ask you to sort of reflect on this, not only given how central Nancy's work is to your thinking, but also to ask you whether you think this ideology perhaps has a geography that might matter, based on the empirical materials with which you're working, right? It seems to me clear that the knowledge work of your Egyptian interlocutors certainly suggests as much. Okay, so the other way that I guess this manifests more explicitly and more related to what I've been asked to think about is the lack of distinction or the amphibious entanglements between the state and private capital, or the relationship between public and private interests, which for me raises a secondary set of questions about what the relevant publics are here. As I see it, this operates on at least a few levels. On the one hand, the claim is that Egyptian peasants are a public which is benefiting from the occupation, but of course based solely on their private interests, right? So there's a kind of interesting tension implicit there. On the other hand, there is a different kind of public in the form of these private investors who want to see their capital investments profitably recouped. So I think we do, arguably, there is a second kind of public in that group. On the third hand, there's the need to placate a broader British public of citizens who are not interested in having the British purse, as it were, spent in overly ambitious forms of occupation. This is particularly the case after the tremendous quote unquote failure of the British East India Company. So arguably understanding these publics together in their interrelation is critical to our understanding of the relations that the state pursues with private capital, not simply as a means to fund the occupation, but to make it profitable as well. So that's more of a reflection, but again, Erin, I wonder if that's something you could help me think better about. So briefly, I have a question about taxation, a kind of pet interest shared by Erin and I. How are we to conceive of taxation as a fiscal category or as a technology of rule in the context of an occupation that was, at least in some instances, using Egyptians' tax revenues not simply to fund the administration of the state, but also to pay back private capital investors? I think that a focus on tax as a form is suggestive here because it points to or provides a vantage from which a kind of normative understanding of the separation between public and private is revealed to be incomplete. And I think this opens up a bigger question, and maybe you can talk about your next project here, a bigger question regarding what this suggests about the epistemological status of the category of tax itself and the ideological shell game naming such forms of sovereign seizure performs. Okay, so how am I doing? Julia, am I all right?
You are great.
Okay.
I would say wrap up and you're good.
Okay, I'm gonna try and wrap up. Okay, so the third thing that I'd like to ask about is the production of Egyptians as investable subjects, that is, subjects worthy of access to metropolitan credit. I'm very convinced about by the David Harvey framework here about the need for a spatial fix, the need to locate new markets, about those the relationship between those markets and novel frontiers of accumulation. But of course, we know that these policies were not enacted evenly across the empire. In the Egyptian context, as Erin so lucidly explains, we know that these policies grew out of an economistic reading of Egyptians as particular kinds of racialized colonial subjects. South of the Sahara, by contrast, people were viewed as being fundamentally too uncivilized to manage credit and debt relations. So I guess I'd like you to reflect more broadly on the transposability of this particular vision of colonial rule. And perhaps relevant here is the context of the occupation, right? That is the fact that Egypt is an occupied territory rather than a colony proper, and this relates to the reasons for the occupation to begin with. I'd also be really interested to hear about the moments of inflection where historical relations of credit and debt, that is, those relations in their pre-occupation form, were rendered visible, translatable, and scalable, such that British and other forms of capital were able to see this as a viable market from whom they could expect returns. I have one more question, but I should ask Julia what to do.
So Emma, I would say go ahead and pose your final question. I think we have a minute for that, if you can do it in a minute.
Okay. Okay. Finally, you and I have talked many times about the possibility that the most trenchant critiques of the actually existing system emerge from people that are subject to the worst abuses of that system, but who are partially outside of that system by the same token. It could go on and on here, right? From Marx, with whom your work shares a kinship, through Hannah Arendt, Rosa Luxemburg. We could think of W.E.B. Du Bois, right? We could think more recently of Ruth Wilson Gilmore, both subject to and critic of the carceral state. All of these people seem to share in common a rejection of an ideology that posits domains as separable. They are interested in critiquing the total social order as it actually exists, or that's my reading. They all seem interested, in fact, in the labors of holding together what a dominant ideology presupposes to hold apart, even as it is premised on, as with Cromer, a tacit acknowledgement of their necessary imbrication or co-constitution. What is distinct of your critics of this logic, and we could think of many contemporary analogs, is that these are people who, unlike the thinkers mentioned above, are not writing tracts and treaties in ways that are obviously legible in many cases. So this is the question. What is opened up methodologically by taking seriously domains of knowledge work that are not codified in theoretical knowledge, but that are experientially, that is empirically premised, and yet which are offering real, intentional, and trenchant and thoughtful forms of political theorization and social critique. And then I'd like to end with how you're working with those particular sources enabled your kind of rehabilitation and rethinking through nationalism. So I think I'll stop there. Apologies for going over.
Well, no, wonderful. Given the way we are at the New School for Social Research, the way that we are, as Erin nicely said, rambunctious interdisciplinarians, the fact that we're kind of sort of adhering to the time schedule is really quite amazing. So that was wonderful. Thank you, Emma. We'll turn now to our colleague in sociology, Benoit Challand.
Thank you, Julia. Thanks, Erin, for giving us the chance to be here together today. I think we're going to talk a lot about colonial economism, but I just want to start by underlining the title of the book, Egypt's Occupation. It's an occupation, and when we talk about the Middle East, we have a certain idea of occupation, maybe Palestine, but bringing the centrality of occupation as a technique of governance and government and discipline, etc., is very important. It's also relevant for our times because we live with studies that try to tackle the presence of settler colonial formation. So I think for the US, with certain ideas of economisms, peculiar ideas of economisms and ecology, etc., I think it's important to reflect on and not lose sight on this word, occupation. So it's a pleasure to comment on your monograph, and my few comments here will concentrate on questions of popular participation, with some questions about the geography of knowledge and exclusion. So to do so, I will start by addressing first the central theme of colonial economism. And in the last page of the book, you note how Gramsci and a large number of Egyptians reach a similar conclusion around economism. Colonial economism is not simply a way to describe the world, but it's a way to remake it in a way that favored a growing class of capitalist actors. So your book does an excellent job at flagging pivotal moments or contrasting dynamics that makes the tensions of economism apparent. It also explained why the emergence of popular democratic politics in Egypt was an impossible task because of colonial economism. So you account for the multiple negative forms of economism by highlighting global elements. If you think of the connections between Punjab, Egypt, the connections between the San Francisco earthquake and the crisis, the financial crisis in London and in Egypt, the model of agricultural banking, you explore this connection with the Philippines. I also know from my studies how that idea of agricultural bank and the institutions being at play in Tunisia. So you account for the multiple negative forms of economism by showing the tiered institutional and legal mechanisms that prevent or openly denied forms of self-representation and self-governing, right? I'm thinking of the various measures taken in the Ministry of Interior in 1894 with this professional executive hierarchy responsive to commands emanating from Cairo, legal measures that you mentioned in your presentation to in the reorganization of the rural resettlement space, the abolition of local elections. You also show the negative force of course, of Orientalist nature of British rule and statements, and the social ecology of cotton production. With this fabulous, sad, but fabulous analysis of the cotton leaf worm crisis that gave the occasion for Egyptian nationalists to chastise peasants in the same manner the British officials had done so 20 years before. So maybe put like this, it's obvious that in colonial or imperial contexts, all sorts of measures would be used to prevent self-determination or the emergence of new forms of egalitarian mass politics from below. But one has to realize that the literature against which you argue or with which you argue, and there are many books on Egypt, right, fail maybe to cut across the class analysis. Maybe the literature fails to document the impact of transnationalism, or tend to treat ecology as a separate realm. Or literature can reproduce at times a binary geography of domination between North and South. What you do in your book is really to articulate those different levels, weaving different factors and scales, and that adds a lot to the literature that deals, say, with Egyptian nationalism, the insertion of the cotton production in Egypt into global markets, or the analysis of Western expertise in Egypt or in the Middle East. So I think I just want to underline, maybe for people who are not familiar with the literature that deals with the Middle East, how your take is deeply original, and you manage to straddle different parts of the literature or a fragmentation that is inherent to the literature, the scholarly literature that deals with the Middle East. I'm thinking, for example, of the problem of the Ottoman empires. And you deal with the time when the Ottoman Empire is collapsing. You are pointing to the consequence that those policies, British occupation, introduce for the long run of Egyptian politics. You do a great job at at keeping an eye on the Ottoman factor and not marginalizing, not neglecting it. You do a great job at showing how the Khedive's network of spies operate and offer for you an original source and material archives. You show how the Ottoman constitution upheaval of 1908 influenced also the politics of democratic demands in Egypt with petitions, demand of the constitution. So there is here a good articulation of those different regions. You also contribute to refine the literature that deals with the political economy of cotton, showing the level of coercion that was involved, very important institution that might be overlooked in political economy literature. You offer a great complement or great dialogue with Timothy Mitchell, even if Mitchell comes later in terms of the chronology. You do bring the nuance and multiple articulations when it comes to the expertise about this problem of ecology, production of cotton. And also you offer another corrective to the literature, such as James Scott, about this vision that peasants are, say, prisoners of this modernity imposed. I mean, you show that there is, from the bottom, from the Egyptian perspective, a clear will for direct political involvement from below, right? The politics of petitions, the constitution, the efforts to create new organization of self-help, solidarity, association, etc. And your book is in dialogue with Ilham Khoury Makdisi, John Shawcroft. I mean, this is a great addition, combining the economy, the ecology with the political mobilization. So you bring important nuances, and those nuances indicate that the question of pivoting mechanisms or articulation lines are not only about the colonial outside dominating the colony, right? But they are also internal articulations. Or put differently, there is a clear local intelligence and demand for popular self-government, but it's also denied and suppressed by varieties of international and local actors. Towards the end of the book, that comes very strongly, showing, for example, how an intellectual like Yusuf Nahas took positions that were decidedly less egalitarian or revolutionary than the conceptions of union and solidarity that had animated the wave of strikes and protests in 1908, 1909. You show how Egyptian nationalists, or series of Egyptian nationalists, I'm not going to list them, but articulated positions that were anti-financial, anti-liberal, and anti-imperialism, but they were not anti-capitalist, right? They failed to stand up on that crucial issue. Or the false attribution of greed to the peasants because of the overcultivation of cotton, which itself created the condition for the spread of the cotton leaf worm. So was it the greed of peasants, or was it because peasants were forced to overcultivate and creating more fodder for those caterpillars, right? So you do a great job to show that Egyptian nationalists failed to articulate a critique of capitalism and instead proposed an effort to rescale capital accumulation inside the territory of the nation state. So that creates the double occupation. Come back to the central theme of the book. You have the occupation, but you have the double occupation, which resonates with another earlier article of yours, right? The tragedy of Egyptian peasants was written twice in red, right? The sacrifice generated by colonial economisms, but also the new push for corvée, forced labor, and expropriation wanted by the nascent class of Egyptian capitalists. So I want to move to 3 questions to conclude. I was personally struck with parallels of later case in or around the Middle East, and your book alludes to the politics of land reform in Nasser, under Nasser, and few nods to the 2011 revolution. The first question is, how different is this, how specific is colonial economism? How different is it from Paul Kingston's study of Britain and the politics of modernization in the Middle East, where Paul Kingston discussed the peasant, not pasha policy that Ernest Bevin introduced as a way to try to save the British Empire. The second point to bring us outside is of the Middle East only. Your analysis reminds me a lot of the project of African socialism after World War II, where after independence, or at the times of independence, African leaders, nationalist leaders, were confronted with this idea of the dream to confront capitalism, but they could never afford to bring head on the dimension of imperialism and influence. They could not afford to be anti-capitalist. And, you know, I'm thinking of a country like Sudan or Yemen, where there are popular uprisings, genuine attempts to organize the local level, but then they run into walls when it comes to the influence of neo-imperial powers, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates. So there is this dimension of anti-capitalism, but I think there's the question of how much one can be anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist at the same time. And that brings to the last point, is the question of Sudan. You know, it's a colony, or it's a double, or it's a triple occupation, right? Sudan was a shared condominium of Egypt and Britain. And I'm curious because, you know, in the book, you speak of colonial taxonomies full of racist ideas. You talk of influence of or resonance, like Bob Vitalis, of, you know, labor management, racialized labor management across Louisiana, Turkey, Egypt, and Philippines. But what did Egyptian officials and Egyptian nationalists say about Sudan? Did they reproduce similar, or did they have a different discourse of ecology that reduced the marginalized Sudanese to an even more subaltern position? So just those are questions, you know, because you do a fantastic job in showing the scales, the global scales, and I would like to hear you speaking beyond the Middle East. So thanks so much. I had other questions, but I leave it there, and I'm sure we can come back to it later. Thank you, Erin.
Wonderful, Benoit. We will now hear from our colleague in anthropology, Anne Stoller.
Well, what a gift to be here. What a pleasure to be here. And also I'm totally flummoxed by where to begin. As I told Aaron before, I think I wrote out 7 to 8 single space pages because there were so many issues that I both wanted to applaud and contest at the same time. And to think about it, and not contest because they're wrong for Egypt, but because they don't fit some of the notions I think I've had before. But that's probably the greatest gift you give us, Aaron. I think one of the best things a book can do is make you question what you think you knew and how you knew it, right? And where you came from in knowing it epistemologically and politically. And in many ways, that's what I'm thinking of here. The comments I want to make are probably not those that people will expect of me. I've just been totally intrigued by banking. I'm just totally floored by thinking about banking. I've been reading about banking. You make me read about banking for months and months now. So in this meticulously researched, conceptually rich book, there is a strange experience. Familiar in parts for anyone who's studied colonialism past and present, as I have for some 40 years, and boldly unique in your treatment of some of the key features and manifestations for Europe at the turn of the 20th century of what colonialism looks like. And I think there's something really special happening in what you're doing. And it's both a casting back to an earlier moment that we've given up of Hobson, of Rosa Luxemburg, of Lenin. I mean, so many things that were there, but also proposing something that I'm not sure has ever been proposed. And turning to the financial and banking underside of British rule and collaborations with Egypt as a laboratory of investment, we're privy to the workings of imperial infrastructures and the inseparable binding of imperial pursuits and financial innovations in ways I think that have been rarely explored. That raises questions about that relationship far beyond the moment you're working in Europe and far beyond the placement of Egypt in the global imperial landscape at the turn of the 20th century. So my first point is about financial revolutions, about financial instruments and imperial formations, and the propositions that you're suggesting about these colonies as laboratories of modernity, not only of architecture and racial dichotomies, and taxonomies, which is something I worked on endlessly, and experimental science, a ton of work on that, as we know, but as laboratories in the development of a global financial capitalism. Still, one can ask the question, and this is one of the questions, are financial revolutions from the 17th to the 20th century not at the very crux of imperial rule in its various manifestations? I think your work returns us to earlier understandings, as I said, of what imperial forms are and what they do, as it opens to an entirely new field with a basic and shattering question: financial revolutions and the production of new financial instruments spurred by and the product of imperial ventures. I don't know if anyone, Aaron, has actually posed it quite that way, that what we know about bonds, about limited liability companies, about a range of the instruments that have been developed over the last 200 to 300 years. The argument points right to a principal logic of imperial sovereignty. Gradated degrees, everybody makes a big deal about occupation. I don't think occupation, I think it's just one within a gradated forms of sovereignty that is a misnomer for exactly what imperial formations are always about. Gradated degrees of control are sometimes as binding, I'm arguing, as thick and fixed ones. Much of colonial studies has argued for some time, is based on arguing on a warped model of empire, as if the British Raj was the most authentic exemplar. I would rather argue that Egypt, what you're doing, what you're looking at, is an unexplored and quintessential. That occupation is not on the edges of empire, that occupation is not the exception to the rule, that it's not a lesser form of control, but an insidiously powerful one. Exemplified in what I would argue is the fiction, and I love this fiction of Egypt. Somebody's gonna have to stop me because I just have too much. That the notion of a veiled protectorate, this is the basic fiction of empire. To call it veiled participates in what I would argue is a performative gesture of all imperial formation, whether it's a trusteeship, whether it's an unincorporated territory, what's an incorporated territory, whether it's what we have at least 15 different names for the gradations of imperial sovereignty that are part of the the center, not the periphery of imperial formations. I would argue that your case, what you're looking at with your focus on these financial entanglements, they are as deep as anything can be, is at the heart of the issue. That veiled protectorates participate, as I just said, it's this gesture of imperial formations in so many places, so many times, always showing resource-rich and poorer parts of the world primed to be governed and never, ever quite ready for self-rule. The deferral of autonomy is the bottom line. Again, whether it be Puerto Rico, whether it be Mexico, whether it be Java, whether it be India, it's always the deferral. And the deferral model is the model that has become, over the last 50 years, the model of development. It is the model of humanitarianism. It is the model of humanitarian intervention. It is the model of empire in its crystalline form. And what we keep doing is going back, well, when there was really an empire, when we really had the real thing, which was the Raj. No, that's not it at all. I think another important really issue that I would like to speak to is the psychic life of colonial power. This issue of the psyche of the other is both a principle and a project and a form of knowledge that has underwritten absolutely every empire. I mean, done obviously, as you know, a lot of work on the politics of comparison, of thinking about colonialisms. Over and over again, this issue of character is at the basis of political and economic decision-making within imperial formations. Who has sufficient character to be trustworthy? Who has sufficient character to really be the kind of person who we can bet on, who will be, was a paper when I was still in graduate school that I remember, it was Chercher l'entrepreneur. Just to find that entrepreneur who we're not sure if he really is one, but let's just nail those few that may be, and let's go invest in them. At the same time, an entire discourse of the lazy native, that they really didn't have that innately, like the real we of Western Europe. The whole racial, mangling of those issues, crucial. You bring that up, those who lack the capacity to reason beyond self-interest. If anything, I see the opposite in terms of Southeast Asia. It wasn't lacking the capacity to reason beyond self-interest. As Clifford Geertz's huge study supposedly said, they shared their poverty. They didn't have enough self-interest, right? They didn't get it right. They could never be real entrepreneurs until we get to development policy and ILO and AID and World Bank, and we're going to infuse them with being what they should be, which is homo economicus. But we couldn't find a homo economicus back then. So that's it's a décalage for me. It's a discrepancy. I can't figure out. Here in Egypt, they're saying everybody has economic interest, but not community and global and national interest. And in Southeast Asia, there's no place I know where they weren't considered the bums of the world. And we can't instill it, and we don't know how. So another issue, how much time do I have, Julia? 1 minute, 2, 3? Oh,
yes, I just sent you a little chat message. I would say if you could wrap up, that would be great. 1 minute would be great.
Oh my God. Okay, just let me do two more things. I was going to go back and 2 more things, really important. The financial revolution, the things that happened at the turn of the century are precisely what happened 200 years earlier with the VOC, with the East Indies Trading Company. They developed they developed financial instruments. They developed the first bonds that had ever been. They developed the pioneering institutional innovations for global capital to move. They did so many of these things that I was going to talk about at some length at a much, much earlier time. So the question is whether financial revolutions are endemic and critical to the very, very making of empire itself. And that is in line. Marx did not only, argue, he argued and understood that debt was crucial. Debt was crucial to what the Latin American economists later made into development and underdevelopment. That as Rosa Luxemburg understood it, there had to be those markets. But there's something else really interesting. Is Egypt, in a way, a precursor to the more widespread model of what is now called the debt colony? The debt colony is now a term used for Greece. It's a term used for Puerto Rico. It's a term extensively now, this crippling sovereign debt that high intrusive regimes of international financial supervision on distressed borrowers to ensure continued debt servicing. Have we not understood, and you have, Aaron, that's so incredible, how much debt and borrowing and loans actually held these imperial forms together when supposedly they were only overseeing, overlooking, occupying. I would argue that so much of that literature has missed how fundamental these issues were. I doubt there's time for it, but I really wanted to contest, and I know this is terrible because see, I don't understand it, the distinction you make between economism and the political. I cannot understand, and it's just my shortcoming. Everything I've ever read, maybe it's because I grew up on it in when I did, it's a 68 heures, right? That it is all the political and economic at the same time. There is no policy that I can see in terms of 250 years of the Indies that was not absolutely about power and biopolitics and the body over and over again. How there was never a discourse of distangling these two. Sometimes I get angry at the planters of the big Uniroyal and Goodyear estate because they didn't worry enough about torture, right? We really shouldn't have to. But exactly the same time that they were all doing that, these multinationals, the turn 1902, the exact period you're talking about, it was reform and it was the growth of plantations. It was increased exploitation and it was the ethical policy at the same time. These were absolutely united. And so for me, the economic, and I don't know, maybe it's that, maybe the interesting question is, why does that discourse appear in certain places and not others? It's such a different kind of population, it seems to me, in Egypt, such a different range of Egyptian actors that could be part of the story. I'm stopping. Thanks for this amazingly delicious piece that provokes so much about Egypt, but also far beyond.
Wonderful. I am going to turn it over to Nancy Fraser for our final comment, and then I'm going to take over a little bit. Aaron is scheduled to give a comment, but I'm going to, with his permission, I am going to suggest that we move into a panel discussion with Aaron sort of at the forefront of the panel, or kind of first responder in the panel discussion. And I've been keeping careful track of the different major questions posed by our panelists, and I'll add some of mine to them as well. Rather than Aaron, doing another 15 minutes solo, if we can move kind of right into a panel discussion in which you're the primary panelist, I think that would be a great way to kind of get everybody talking together. So and keep us on task, on time. Nancy, are you with us?
Yes, I'm right here.
Wonderful. Okay, so Nancy is with us. Great. And Nancy, please welcome, and please take it away.
Great. Well, like the others who've spoken, I'm really thrilled to be part of this and kind of knocked over by the brilliance of this book. Aaron, congratulations. You've really done something quite extraordinary. I mean, I had read a short piece of yours here and there, but I always knew you were smart, but this is really mind-blowing. The level of conceptual sophistication, the research, keeping all the balls in the air, everything in the right place. The reader is never lost. You always know what the point is and why what's being unfolded at a given point is being unfolded then. So kudos. I, unlike the other speakers, am really kind of a dummy when it comes to knowing much about the history of colonialism and imperialism and the the Middle East and let alone Egypt. So my comments are really going to be more at the conceptual level because I found so much of interest in your book at that level. And echoing what Emma and Benoit have said in particular, I'm finding this concept of colonial economism extremely rich and interesting. And, but even before getting to that, just what you say about economism on its own struck me as very, very helpful. Again, just repeating some of the points that I think have already been hit, but they're worth hearing again. It's not just a concept that applies to the left but fundamentally to liberalism. It's a concept that emerges within and from, I would say, capitalism. In fact, I would go further and say that it is always, even where it doesn't fully triumph, it's always there as a temptation, as the common sense of capitalism, that there really is some distinctive set of interactions that can be called economic, that they really can and should be arranged in a specific space that we call an economy, and in that sense hived off from economies others, however those others are understood. The reason I think it's the common sense of capitalism, even when it doesn't emerge as a full-blown ideology, is that, and here I want to see if this accords with you or not, taking the point which I thought Benoit stated very beautifully, it's not, economism is not aimed at describing the world, but at remaking it, at prescribing the world. So it's trying to reshape the world. I want to ask, though, whether you would agree, if it's so intimately related to capitalism, then could we say that the economic or even the economy, far from being simply a project or simply false consciousness, is somehow the name of a real abstraction in capitalist society? And if so, that would begin to help us understand, as you so well point out, why this increased immersion of Egyptian peasants and other Egyptians in this tangled web of financial credit and other things, that this is the economic as a real abstraction. And if we say that, then this leads me to now try to bring the political in and try to think about the relation. One thing I would say is that the economic, in the sense just described, and as you described, is something quite new, relatively speaking, in the world. The political is something not new, much older. We could say that how the political is understood must change with the emergence of the economic, when they are counterposed as not the other, when the political means not the economic and the economic means not the political, then that must change what we mean by the political. But I'm having a harder time getting a grip in your book on the concept of the political in this. Yeah. So here are some questions, some things that I thought about. At one level, you're making the case. Okay, let me backtrack. We have the quintessentially political operation of modern states and maybe earlier states of subjectivation, of subject formation, right? And so you tell us and show us beautifully how the British colonizers constructed their subjects as politically unfit for self-rule. And I would assume that all colonialisms in the modern era do that in one way or another. But what is special about this case, from what I understand, is that the way in which Egyptians are seen as unfit for self-rule is because they are constructed as solely economic. That made me ask about other possibilities. I mean, there's more than one way to do this trick, right? What other options? How about if they could be unfit because they're tribal, communalist, overly saturated with kinship relations, in other words, not individuals. This might have nothing to do with the economic in the modern capitalist sense. So is economic subjectivation on the part of the British here aimed at a kind of individualization? Is there a backstory about the communal world that this economization is aimed at disrupting? In general, this is kind of what I was expecting Annie to talk about.
Yeah.
The kin, because it's not just the political and the economic. There's also this whole other arena of social relations that are neither political in the modern sense nor economic in the modern sense. And I'm really just wondering how that fits into the story. I appreciate that unlike the main conservative ethnographic strand of occupation that comes in later, that Cromer and company are really not emphasizing the economic. But I want to know what they're thinking and what's going on in the background that's neither economic nor political. Okay, that's one question. I also want to ask you more about the political. So first of all, I mean, I don't even know what exactly the British mean by the political. At one level, they probably congratulate themselves on parliamentary rule and some relatively expanded suffrage by this period. But maybe they also mean rational administration. And don't they also mean ruling the seas and military might? So and then as Benoit stressed, there's this whole history in Egypt itself of petitioning and all of these quintessentially political practices of a political repertoire, not to mention the state building efforts that immediately precede the occupation, still under Ottoman oversight, but nevertheless a kind of national state building project that you described. So is there some other political in Egypt? I imagine, and probably not just one, I imagine a range of politicals. So is part of the story here a conflict among different politicals and maybe even different economics? I'd love to hear more about that kind of thing. Well, one other point, since you mentioned, and rightly, Ellen Wood, I couldn't help thinking about her book about the imperialism of our time, which she calls the empire of capital. And did colonial economists ever dream of an empire of capital, meaning, hello, is someone there? I hear some, okay. Did they ever dream, in other words, of a network, of a financial network, a banking system, a division of labor so perfectly elaborated that imperial political rule and occupation would be unnecessary? I mean, that would be the real economist fantasy. And I think that Wood is descriptively wrong to think that we actually have such a thing today. That seems not a hard case to make. But as a utopian imaginary that flows from this way of thinking, I can see it's a temptation. And I'm just wondering, I think this maybe relates to what Anne was saying about occupation, the material force of occupation, and the dream of an occupation without occupation,
Exactly.
so to speak. Anyway, I think I can stop there because I have more half-baked questions than real thoughts. But just to reiterate how much I enjoyed reading the book and how much I learned from it and how eager I am to hear what others are going to say in this next discussion. Thank you.
Wonderful, Nancy. Thank you very much. And we are at 7:20 right now. So I'm going to suggest that the panelists reconvene or convene as an actual panel, and maybe everybody can turn their cameras on if that's possible, who is on the panel, so that we kind of appear somewhat like a panel. And I would, okay, here we go. I would like to revisit many of the questions that our different discussants posed in their comments, and allow Aaron a chance to respond and answer, but encourage us to be our lively interdisciplinarians who are always up in each other's business and always present in one another's thinking, and allow the panelists to jump in and provide their own thoughts and answers, and I may even throw some others into the mix before we take some question and answer. I have begun to look at the question and answer on that's the function in Zoom for the audience to use, and begun to sort of collect some of those as well. We don't have a ton of time left, but we'll do the best that we can. And I apologize both to audience members and even to the panelists themselves if we don't get around to everything. I'm going to start with this. I'm going to start with a question to maybe get everybody, all of our panelists mentally jumping and thinking. It's not something that any of us have raised yet, but I think that we should be raising always and everywhere, which is what is at stake. I think everybody in the panel, brought up the central concept of economism and colonial economism in their comments. But I'd like everybody, and Aaron first and foremost, to really think about and let the audience know why you think it's important at this moment, throughout history, or in any other discipline in which one might engage critically with capitalism, to grasp the concept of economism and question the way in which the political and the economic are cleaved off from one another as self-evident, separate categories that sort of unfold according to particular forms of knowledge, particular types of subjectivity, et cetera, et cetera. So Aaron, perhaps you'd like to begin and just tell us why you feel, not only as a historian, but as a general critic of capitalism, why you think economism is something that does useful critical work in the world, and why you think adding colonial to our apprehension of that analytic kind of category is, or concept, is something that we should all be doing. Not just as historians.
Okay, that's an easy question. So I'll say a few things, but I mean, first, thank you all. And one of the things that struck me in listening to all of you was just how much your comments reminded me of how much I have learned from all of you along the way, and how much I see things that I've learned from all of you reflected in the book that I wrote. So to answer Julia's question, I'll give a kind of quickie hyper-presentist answer,
Yes,
and then another answer that builds on that, but also has to do with these versions of the question about what the political is, about the connection between those domains. So the quickie hyper-presentist answer, I mean, maybe I'll say more later about my thinking about this as a book that was written in and through a particular set of moments, the last of which was overshadowed by the presence of Donald Trump, has to do with kind of noticing the way that ideas about, I mean, particularly in academic circles, that ideas about economic determination get kind of identified narrowly with one quite marginal tradition of left thought, and at the same time pervade everyday discourse, particularly in this country, in ways that I think we really ought to take notice of much more regularly and acutely. And in this sense, there's a kind of unmentioned, but I think pretty heavy-handed in places, like resonance between my descriptions of colonial economism as a particularly racialized way of making claims about economic determination, and both the kind of centrality of ideas about economic performance to Trump's utterly kind of bizarre theories of his own power, but also to the ways in which kind of liberal forms of economism that have been raised to contest the right in the United States often contain within them similarly problematic suggestions that the real issue is that there are some subsets of an electorate or a populace in this country who are only capable of responding to their own economic interests. They need to be dealt with in one way, and then there's something more that some other population of political actors is engaged in. Now, part of the question is like, what is that something more? What is being suggested there? And I think this gets to Emma's question about like whether the separation ever occurs, to Nancy's question about real abstraction, to Anne's various questions about this. And Nancy, like, yes, I am suggesting that we can and should think about the economic as a real abstraction. It is a kind of a possibility that is raised in thought by certain forms of social practice that make it possible to imagine that there is this domain that can operate law-like according to the individualistic transactions of large numbers of people. And once that exists, it raises a whole set of questions about how that way of making decisions about how a society should be organized, about what sorts of things are valued, about who is free to do what sorts of things, might relate to other ways of deliberating over them. And so I think, you know, the suggestion that is often made by the figures that I introduced at the beginning of the book, most notably John Stuart Mill, who is, I mean, really kind of critical to the articulation of a form of racial thought to this question about the relationship between the economic and the political. Mill is suggesting that the kind of essence of civilization and the ability of civilized populations to practice real politics has to do with some capacity to kind of overcome the play of immediate economic interests, such that it might be possible to deliberate in different ways about how society should be organized. And so, I mean, this is something that like I was still wrestling with at the end of the book, but what I'm trying to deal with, and part of why, as critical as I am of them, I find some of these nationalist thinkers so interesting and compelling, is that I think that they are grasping the fact that this is a problem that is posed by the way their society is organized, that under conditions in which people are more and more dependent upon, say, flows of credit in order to sustain themselves and their own families, that their ability to freely make certain other kinds of choices about how they might want to live their lives look very different. And here, you know, Julia, I found your work on financialization in the US immensely helpful in kind of thinking about how a similar set of dynamics have played out in this country, right? And we might think about how a whole array of social policies that would aim at kind of removing the provision of certain kind of basic human needs from the play of market forces wouldn't just meet those material needs, but might actually create space for other forms of deliberation and other ways of making choices about how we want the world that we live in to be organized. So I think that the problem of economism sort of names a set of anxieties around those sorts of issues that are birthed at the moment at which it becomes possible to see the economic as this law-like space or domain, and that never exactly go away. And I mean, Emma and I were talking about this a couple of weeks ago. Like, I am not equipped to be doing serious psychoanalytic analysis of my sources and historical actors, but I do think that there is a way of reading this discourse as a kind of hostile projection, that this is certainly an anxiety that kind of haunts British liberal thought proper. And part of what's going on here is that the resolution is simply to attribute the problem to a set of deficient actors, when in fact it's kind of innate to the way that capitalism organizes the kind of topography of concepts through which we make sense of our world.
Beautiful. Would any of the other panelists care to weigh in on the question of what's at stake, not just in this book, but in the very kind of scholarly critical concept of economism itself, why it's important to recognize the colonial dimension, name that, study it historically and otherwise. Why does it matter? Why does it matter in the world today that we need to recognize that an important process of or important component of a capitalist social order, with all its sort of distributional and ecological consequences, is this way in which a distinct realm of social experience is cleaved off and identified as "quote unquote" the economy, and the supporting, common sense beliefs about that realm they penetrate the world. They penetrate institutions, policies, personal dispositions and affect, institutions and instruments, but they don't describe the social world. They, in fact, create it in ways that are fundamentally political, even though they deny the politics. They deny that power, coercion, violence, etc., is in play. So I'm wondering if any of the other panelists would sort of like to say anything further about why apprehending economism, whether you like that term or whether you want to use a different term, and apprehending the colonial simultaneously, as Aaron has done, are so important, not just in critical studies of capitalism, but really even in today's world and in this post-electoral moment.
Well, I suppose one of the things, may I?
Yeah.
Yeah.
One
sure,
of the things that's really struck me is that studying colonialism for as long as I have has convinced me that these are histories of the present, that almost every single space where we have the question of il faut défendre la société, where we have to defend society against those enemies within, is always an implication of the economic and political at the same time, which is why it makes it difficult. Studying the colonial has made it possible for me to understand better the ways in which that enemy is construed, both as a body that doesn't get it politically or economically, or as a danger politically and economically, which is why I'm being so rough on this, because I find that distinction is so easy to unravel for me in so many ways, that the distinction has so little gravitas that it constantly falls into itself once one doesn't look at it in terms of, if you take the language of one has to defend society against itself, you're immediately implicating both the economic and the political, which is exactly what we're dealing with now, as Foucault would have argued. And it's not just that it's Foucault, many years ago.
I just wanted to add a very brief comment that is totally focused on the present moment in the United States. So here's my prediction. You heard it first from me. Biden is going to appoint another Goldman Sachs alum to Treasury. Forget Elizabeth Warren, because the markets must be happy, because the economy has its own thing, and you have to respect it. You can't touch it. You've got to just let it go. The financial world, at the very least.
Yeah.
That's why we have to criticize economism right now. On the other hand, I can't resist adding, culturalism is equally problematic and politically devastating. And the other, what I fear in a Biden presidency, in the Biden presidency, is that we have Wall Street takes care of the economy, and then we progressives are left to moralize with one another about and virtue signal and blah, 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 blah. So there is such a temptation in this country, at least, to bifurcate and dichotomize what is a economic issue that's basically let capital have its due. And then you get this very truncated picture of what the political is. And it often ends up being indistinguishable from moralization. So whether I want to say that the economic has to be made political, or whether we want to stop using the word the economic and find other terms, I don't know. But I think economism is a huge weight hanging on all of our for life.
That's a great way to phrase it. You're always very pithy and sort of praxis oriented, Nancy, and I love that. That the economy needs to be made political, and even in our consciousness and in our awareness, whether we're scholars or whether we're citizens, because there's so much working against that, as you, I think, rightly say, left and right, Democrat and Republican. It doesn't matter in the context, that circumstances we find ourselves in, and whether it's markets need to be happy. Markets need to do their thing. They need to be respected. They need to be heard. They need to be accommodated. And whether markets are managed by experts, or whether and those experts are public experts or private experts, or whether you kind of leave them alone and trust their, ostensibly organic and natural functionings, they're not political. They don't and they should not care, and those who do manage them should not care about other kinds of metrics of human well-being. It's supposed that those will work it out for themselves. There's actually, I think, and Aaron's book is really important for actually forcing us to see this and pausing for a moment. There's a jump between saying that with respect to the economy, and then you said Goldman Sachs, you said stock markets. How do we get to finance all of a sudden? That's another kind of mystification, I think, that's part of this. And Aaron may be, and I think Benoit's comments and others' comments about the first debtor society. I would put Haiti out there as my that's what I would offer for my candidate. But nonetheless, where, I'm thinking in Aaron's book, historically, at exactly the same time, you have ostensibly free-holding yeoman farmers I shouldn't use that phrase, pushing into the Great Plains, who are saddled by the same kind of debt, coming from the north, from the industrial north and financial northeast, giving rise to populist movements there, right? And so, it's happening in these two very different places. And in one space, it's, not that they're wholly successful or anything like that, but in one place on the Great Plains, nobody, very, very much deeply influential in American politics for a generation, the political recognition of those credit entanglements. And then in Egypt, the exact same thing is going on, and we need more help from Aaron to see it. And I think that's really interesting. But that move from, or I don't know if it's a move, in time, or if it's a move in conceptualization from the economy, and then, oh, wait, but then there's this overarching financial thing that happens, and finance is in charge of the economy. The economy is determines distributions in the economy, politics, or something else. So I think Aaron's, and Aaron's book is really helpful for bringing all of this to life. Now, somebody said projection, and somebody said bodies, and we have so little time, and I have so many questions, and we haven't gotten from our panelists and some from the Q&A. So let me go to a couple right now for all the economists. For all the panelists.
Oh.
It keeps with this idea of finance. Aaron, you said about you're not a good psychiatrist or psychologist of your subjects, but you feel like there's some projection going on. I actually feel like there's some projection going on as well, but it looks very differently. It seems to me that somebody like Comer is actually, there's a projection of kind of fears, attributes, wished for attributes of those British small investors, actually, or anxiety about British investors onto actually the Egyptian freeholders, right? Isn't it supposed to be the British investor who can behave in some of these self-interested, but yet in the aggregate socially beneficial, even on a global stage, ways, and what motivates those folks? We've talked about this a lot before, but how does the investable subject, colonial subject, penetrate into the consciousness of those British investors who are expanding as a group of people? It's going down the socioeconomic ladder. Women are becoming investors now. They're becoming, good, responsible, liberal subjects in Great Britain, and then they're making these investments, imagining what exactly about this Egyptian peasantry. And I think it goes to issues of the social world and kinship and intimacy, as I think it was Anne was suggesting. And I want to look at what Benoit said about this too. Yes. How does this economism, perhaps, or this idea of the investable colonial subject penetrate or travel back to the metropole? It certainly doesn't when you're talking about financial relationships that are reconstructed in the post-bellum South, American South. Benoit mentioned also, other places and as did Emma, Sudan, India, Kenya. How does the penetration of the consciousness of the investable colonial subject, which is so much part of economism in your book, how does it inform British investors or British institutions through which folks invest in ways that does make the financial relationships that you're really bringing to life and making political for us, right? Very distinctive and different. And everybody wants to hear, Aaron, all of your interlocutors want to hear about different parts of the British Empire. But perhaps some of it has to do with existing relationships or prior relationships between trade or financial between Britain and Egypt prior to your period. Or maybe it has to do, again, with something domestically about the transformation in the kind of social place practice of investment among British in the metropole that makes makes relationships between Egyptian Egyptian farmers and British finance quite different than we would see, yes, in Sudan, in India, Kenya, etc. I hope that's too long of a question, but take it and run with it.
I mean, so I might take this in a slightly different direction that kind of routes us back through some of these other kinds of comparative questions that Anne and Benoit and Emma were asking. I mean,
Beautiful.
Anne, I did not think about the book in this way until you described it in this way. But I think, I mean, it is certainly the case that Egypt is often, and the occupation is often adduced as a first instance of a whole variety of practices that are more familiar to us now. And there's more and more really good work of this kind coming out. So my colleague, Amy Janelle, who's a legal historian of the Ottoman Empire, has been developing a really interesting set of arguments about how the occupation provides some of the architecture for what becomes the mandate system after World War I, right? There's a historian named Jamie Martin at Georgetown who's done some really interesting work on thinking about Egypt as the kind of first instance of austerity politics in its modern form, along exactly the sorts of lines that you were suggesting, right? A kind of akin to Greece. And it was striking, like in the moment when the Greek debt crisis was really taking off, I all of a sudden started getting phone calls from journalists that kind of wanted to think through this comparison. And I think, you know, part of what's happening in this moment, and in some sense, I'm less interested in kind of making a case for the importance of Egypt than of what Egypt might represent. Right. It is that there's a kind of pluralization of possible comparative frames and models that mean that various actors doing different sorts of things in different parts of the world can kind of situate themselves like within different global geographies, right? So the book kind of deals in various places with how, like, the Roosevelt administration, which has just effectively occupied the Philippines, wants to think about how things that are happening in Egypt might then be transposable there. But it's also the case that the similarities between the kinds of financial practices that are happening in Egypt and in the parts of the Midwest where the populist movement is taking off, that those similarities start to render comparisons between the US and Egypt plausible to actors at the time in ways that would seem deeply weird, I think, to most US historians right now. And part of that also has to do, I think, with the way that understandings of how this kind of colonial rule is going to operate in distinction to something like the British Raj makes that sort of modularity more thinkable, right? The idea is that this is going to be a form of government on the cheap that is going to generate sort of forms of globally available knowledge about this place that actually foreclose the necessity of having the kinds of like intimate relationships with colonial subjects, to use your language, Anne, or just the kind of heavy foot on the ground that was characteristic of some place like the British Raj. And so this means that, you know, these financial institutions don't know all sorts of things about the place where they are operating. And in many instances, they can basically get away with not needing to until things fall apart. So I was recently describing to someone an anecdote that I think I ended up having to cut from the book. But when the financial crisis happens, you know, you have all of these foreign financial interests that are making loans to farms. The people making the loans know nothing about farming. They want nothing to do with farming. They certainly don't want to own and run farms. And they make a bunch of bad debts and then are stuck figuring out, like, what am I going to do managing a failing farm in the middle of the desert? And in a sense, those moments of breakdown actually tell us something about the kind of like transposable forms of knowledge that have made it possible for investing publics of the kind that you're describing, Julia, to actually sort of make calculations about the difference between an investment in Egypt and an investment in a railway stock in the United States on the basis of a much more limited set of criteria that you know, effectively mean they can say like, well, what's the return going to be? You know, what are the legal institutions in place to back my claim? Who's going to be telling me about this and in what language? And like,
and that's
you know,
action. It's like, if they are at all, because of course, if you get to a speculative boom, people aren't actually behaving in that way. They're just throwing money because other people are throwing money. And that's where I said projection, because then you sort of get the you know, the investor behaving as if they're sort of a self-interested, maybe not all that rational, perhaps greedy, you know, and not really fit for some kind of you know, virtuous and even-minded and you know, critical, as you're saying it, you know, judicious type of investment that really will produce you know, the outcomes that are promised. I want to do two things before we wrap up, and I wish we had so much. I mean, I have pages and pages of things for us to talk about, much less Anne's 7-8 pages, right, of single notes.
I had so many things I wanted to write.
So
no, I can't.
You do a lightning round of Q&A, and then we're going to try to drive it home with Emma and Benoit on ecology. Okay, so Aaron, are you ready for the lightning round?
Can I do one on limited liability companies?
Can you ask a question?
One sentence.
Oh, one sentence, sure, one sentence, and then Aaron, you take a drink of something, and get ready for your lightning round.
So I wonder if we might think of imperial forms, Aaron, as limited liability corporations, that they invented it, but they also remained it as ways of meting out risks and deferrals of risk and ensuring that no one was quote unquote to blame.
Yeah, I mean, to this point and many that Emma was making earlier, right? Another kind of basic imperial precondition to what's happening is that the prior arrangements of indebtedness of the state mean that the state cannot be the agent that is borrowing. And so there are all sorts of ways in which the investment in individual subjects and forms of what we would now call, you know, like corporate forms of public-private partnership become mechanisms for circumventing what might have otherwise at that point seemed like a more conventional set of arrangements where the state is the kind of institutional buffer between international finance and
so you're not help you, because now you're saying this and I'm thinking about post Southern belles with all of their kind of racial, social, and cultural capital who get, you know, if you want to revive the Southern economy, you marry that lily white daughter off to a Northern industrialist or an industrialist or nobility. And it's actually, you know, going back to bodies, going back to intimacy, going back to the category of private versus public or private versus market. You know, it's those kinds of ways in which, you know, those sort of deeply intimate non-market ways that bring capital back to the postbellum South.
And limited liability.
Yes, exactly. Okay, are we ready? Aaron, are you ready for your lightning round?
Yeah, but everybody else is going to jump into the lightning round too, right?
This is you, and this is, you get 1 minute for question. You're okay. Are you ready? It's not even a question. This is going to be fun. Okay. All right. Are you ready? So here's question number 1. You get 1 minute. Occupation of Sudan. Egyptian occupation of Sudan. How, we'll just say very broadly, but you get 1 minute. How does that factor into your account?
It factors in very poorly. Like Benoit was asking a really excellent question. Here, I would direct everyone to the really fantastic work of Alden Young and the earlier work of my colleague Eve Trout Powell. I mean, Benoit, who has read the literature knows this, right? That there is a whole structure of like further racialization in these relationships, and one of the things that interests me about it is the way that the form of political and ecological rescaling that becomes a kind of precondition for the actual project of national capital formation ends up reproducing a set of effectively imperial relations of extraction with
and
racialized populations to the south. I mean, that play out in particular over control over water, and frankly that that persist into the present. So I recently gave an interview, and sorry, okay, I'm done.
Light ground. Okay. All right. This is great. You're doing great. You get, I don't know what that is. 100 points. You got 100 points. You got a perfect score on that one. Okay. But while we're talking about this sort of later period and these kinds of themes, I will allow you to continue with the next question, which was, do you know anything about Frantz Fanon's reception in Egypt kind of under Nasserism?
This is way outside my wheelhouse, and here I would recommend the work of Sarah Salem, who actually gave a talk in the politics department here at NSSR recently. It may have even been recorded, but I'm gonna punt on that one.
That was an unfair way to phrase it. The broader question is, that came out of the Q&A, I'll frame it more broadly, which is in that period of sort of, as you say, like nationalistic capital accumulation, how much in terms of those, as Emma put it, sort of those, call them peripheral or subaltern critiques, were your sense of that later period, the Nasserist period, how much conversation is going on between groups globally critiquing economism and racialization as you just described it, right? Like kind of how much international dialogue is going on there, and Fanon would have been kind of one person or one voice.
Yeah, I mean, so there there has been, for all sorts of not accidental reasons, a kind of resurgence of interest in the internationalisms of anti-colonialism and decolonization in the middle of the 20th century. I think that there are real risks in trying to read or interpolate Nasser as a kind of ally of or progenitor of the kinds of anti-racist politics that many of us are interested in right now. And here, I mean, in some ways, the question about that moment in the middle of the 20th century that interests me more is the one that Benoit was posing about the possibility of like the ways in which certain forms of committed anti-imperialism get pitted against more robust forms of anti-capitalism. And that, what is often described as Arab socialism could be refigured as a kind of reworking in some ways through foreign policy of efforts to kind of stitch together and supplement shortfalls in capital that had basically become unlivable for large numbers of people in the country. And so in a sense, like sometimes I think there's a suggestion that the project of import substitution industrialization in the 50s and 60s kind of succeeded on its own terms until it was scuttled by neoliberalism. And what's missing from that story is the way that it was kind of bankrolled by an internationalist moment during the Cold War that kind of was particular to that moment and might not easily be replicated again, in the present.
Wonderful. So I think you won the lightning round. You're totally the winner. Good.
It's 8 o'clock.
Apologies to everybody else on the Q&A. Aaron, and especially, Emma and who brought up these issues in your comments. There's this whole other part of the book that we, I think, just have barely paid any attention to, with the exception of Emma and Benoit's comment, but the issue of this other category of the natural, right? And capitalism as a way of organizing nature and its dependency on, not just natural resources, but the category of the natural, which is sort of free and exploitatable, in ways of the non-natural, say, for example, aren't. So maybe perhaps, we've spoken quite a lot about that boundary work between the economy and politics. We talked a little bit about, the boundary between the public and the private, or the intimate and the institutional. Aaron, would you like to say a word? And maybe Emma and Benoit would also like to jump in about what your kind of ambitions and argument with the book was and is with respect to that aspect of capitalist occupation, the ecological dimensions.
I'd actually like to answer this sort of by posing a question to Nancy. And this dates back to a conversation that we started having like right when I started at the New School. But it should be apparent that I have found your framework of more hidden abodes immensely helpful for thinking through all sorts of things. But one of the things about it that in its clarity, I think, in expositions that I've read so far, is sometimes less apparent, is the way in which boundary struggles kind of become implicated in each other and kind of offset against each other. And so one of the things that I'm interested in thinking about in the later parts of the book that are dealing kind of directly with questions of ecological crisis have to do with how the sort of rising costs of pillaging the landscape for its free gifts end up providing a basis for a kind of re-racialization of peasants, for a kind of reconfiguration of family labor, such that basically from the early 1900s onwards, the viability of cotton cultivation in Egypt becomes heavily dependent on legally sanctioned forms of exploitation of children in ways that, now departed wonderful political scientist in my field, Ellis Goldberg, wrote this incredible book about the kind of long-term effects for development generally in Egypt of the centrality of child labor to this particular form of peripheralization. And so, I guess the question is like how or whether the narrative of the book for you like posed questions about the interrelation between the more hidden abodes. It's a bad way of posing the question, but I hope you understand what I'm getting at.
Yeah, I'm very much getting it. And I'm actually at the moment, struggling to write something about this very question. And because from an analytic point of view, one can distinguish hidden abodes, but in real life, they intersect, et cetera, et cetera. And one thing that interests me, I hope this is responsive, is that the idea of environmentalism as a standalone movement is already, well, I coined the term ecologism. We have not just economism, but we have ecologism. It's partly, as in the case of economism, that this is the view that this is the fundamental basis of everything and must trump every other claim. And so it's like the base, and everything else is superstructure. That's one kind of similarity. And then, in politics, it basically means that there's no possibility for a counter-hegemonic bloc that could, really. So, it's kind of interesting. I've been influenced by the Catalan thinker, what is his name? Martinez-Allier, Johan. And he coined a terrible phrase, which I hate, called the environmentalism of the poor. And fortunately, that has now been renamed something like livelihood environmentalism. So it's really about how defending a habitat and a material standard of living and a form of life, and these are completely, entangled with one another. And it's only when you get the economism of the rich, and that is a good phrase, which he didn't use, which is wilderness protection and so on, then you get the standalone. So yeah, part of the political problem for today is to really think through these connections.
Given the moment that we're in, maybe this can be a place to wrap up, and your pessimistic comments about what's coming. I think one reason why this kind of thinking might be helpful is that it might direct our attention to the importance of other areas of what the government in this country and other parts of the world can do, and their implications for, say, the question of climate change, that lie well beyond the domain of environmental regulation as such, right? So if we think about, here I'm drawing on the work of my friend Daniel Aldana Cohen, that if we think about how the pandemic has mobilized, incredible amounts of political will, at least around the question of housing, and we think about cities as spaces that emit large amounts of carbon and that will need to be redesigned, then it becomes possible to kind of think about a nexus between struggles for affordable housing and forms of urban design that might actually mitigate climate change in meaningful and just ways. And so
right. And what
we might be pessimistic.
Are these ecological struggles? Are these struggles for social reproduction? Are these, at a certain point, it becomes, academic to sort of
a struggle for justice. I think this is a wonderful place to stop, although I'm heartbroken that, I think I had sketched out 6 questions, that was drawn from the panelists, and maybe we got to 2 of them. And then the Q&A is chocked with full of wonderful additional questions that did not even appear in the lightning round. So I do apologize to everybody, but I think it really is just a testimony to the richness of this book and how much it really helps one to think critically about so many different things, not just as scholars, but as citizens and as human beings. So Aaron, thank you.
Thank all of you.
And what?
I just was saying thank you to all of you.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you to everyone.
Thank you, Aaron.
Who participated and who
joined. For writing such a great book.
Yeah.
Thank you,
Aaron.
Doing this work. And we are recording, or we have been recording, and so we will also be posting. So folks who want to be able to revisit this with students and colleagues, and et cetera, please look for that. You should be receiving a notification. Good night, everyone.
Julia, you were amazing. Thank you.
Thank you. Managed to do this on my phone, which was, an exciting challenge. All right. Good night, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.